Hello and welcome to Bulimia Sucks. I'm your host, Kate Hudson-Hall, and thank you so much for listening. Now, if you didn't know, this is a platform for people to share relatable, uplifting, and inspiring conversations based on an eating disorder. And episodes including talking to people struggling right now with their eating disorder, sharing their personal journeys, their difficult stories, and how they have taken their steps, maybe that first step onto their recovery path or their steps as they transition through their recovery. Also to people who have overcome their eating disorder. And professionals who work with people with an eating disorder who may have or may not have had an eating disorder. So welcome to everybody. It's great to have you here. Now, before we dive in, I just want to mention my new book, which is called Anxiety Hacks. And the subtitle is Proven Techniques, Tools and Tips to Calmness. So I'm very excited about this. And the book at the moment is still with the formatters, but hopefully in the next couple of weeks we will have moved on from that, and the plan is to launch in October. So I'm very excited about that, and I have a lot more information on my website. So if you were wanting to check that out, if you go to katehudson-hall.com, all the information is on there. Now, our fabulous guest today is Kyira Wackett. Now, Kyira has joined our podcast before in episode 95, sharing her journey with her eating disorder. And today she is back with us to discuss recovery steps and how we can begin to shed those layers, peel back that onion and unravel the steps of how you can move forward. So Kyira is a licensed mental health therapist and entrepreneur. She is the owner of Adversity Rising, where she equips people with the confidence and skills to write their own story. She also sees patients in a private therapy practice, treating eating disorders, anxiety disorders, and trauma. Her specialities lie in communication, boundary settings, distress tolerance, forgiveness of oneself and others, and cognitive reframe and empowerment. Kyira is a trauma survivor, as well as lives in recovery from an eating disorder and generalized anxiety. She believes that all of us have the capacity to author our own stories and relinquish the holds of shame and fear and anxiety with the right support and skills. So welcome, Kyira. It's fabulous. Thank you so much for joining us again.
Yeah, I'm so excited to be here. I was looking forward to our conversation for several days leading up to it, as I saw it on my calendar. So I'm very excited to continue our conversation from before.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about how. I have a question for you. So with regards to recovery, how do you feel, what do you think is the most helpful thing for your clients in their recovery journey?
I think, obviously, depending on where people are at in terms of in their recovery, not in their recovery, contemplating recovery, completely rejecting the idea they have an eating disorder, I think that there is different intervention points. But one of the things that I found to be most helpful, and I think it really got solidified for me when I was working with adolescents and teens, was the honest conversation that this is a lifelong process. Because I think a lot of the times there's like the really high acuity stages of recovery early on. And sometimes it's, very focused on just getting people to regulate eating patterns or relearn some of the cues of their body or get their certain physical metrics at a level. But I think having a really honest conversation around our job, especially on the mental health side, is to give you tips, tools, skills, all that, process through these things, but to really create space for you to lean into this being a lifelong process. You're not failing when the next blip happens. You're not screwing up when, you have lapses or relapses, that this is really what it looks like. And I think setting the stage for that really has changed the game in the conversations I have with people. And I think it removes some of the shame when the process happens of the ups and downs and the evolution of their recovery.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Because it's all about learning about you and the way that you, where you're thinking at the moment, you're feeling at the moment, and how you can begin to work with that positively.
Right.
And begin to change, well, there's a lot to it, but to begin to change those negative behaviors.
Right. Right. And realizing too that I can't plan for, when I started my recovery journey in my early 20s, I had no idea what it would be like to experience the death of somebody really important to me, and how that was going to trigger things from childhood, and how it would feel like it was right next to me to grab my eating disorder again, or what it would be like to become pregnant and have my body change and have the hormone shifts. You can't plan for the different things you're going to go through in the future in terms of what's going to happen, so you don't experience the kind of callback to your eating disorder, or even some of those kind of slides, or at least that's the way I describe them, is like I kind of slide into some of those things without even realizing it. But I think creating that awareness and calling it out in advance to say, no, this is going to come back again as an invitation. It's always going to be sort of wired in your, imprinted on your self, your DNA, whatever. And so thinking about what is the awareness we need to create now, so that when those things happen, we can try to bring attention to it as quickly as possible to change course.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But then over time, I do believe that gradually, as all of the patterns change over time, eventually you will no longer have that dire need to, whether it's restricting or binging, purging, or whatever it might be.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's that kind of extinction of the pattern in the brain, the wiring. So over, the longer you practice doing something else, the more opportunities you have to face that adversity or pain or trauma, and then it doesn't become the response. You kind of uncouple those two things. And so, that neurons that fire together, wire together kind of idea. Well, if you stop firing them together, it stops becoming the automatic response. So I think for me, now 10 plus years in recovery, something that would have happened 5 or 6 years ago that pulled me back, and it took me maybe a few months to work through it. Now, when I have these things that happen sort of on a similar level of intensity or pain, it takes me maybe a week. And my goal, long-term thinking, when I'm 20, 30, 40 years in recovery, and I keep practicing and have that diligence in it, then eventually it becomes kind of, we transcend it. We aren't thinking about it. We're just sort of doing the things because it's no longer like even a familiar route we explore.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have, so I am, I don't know exactly, 30 years down the line from when I first started to get help with my eating disorder. And I have recently, I had a very difficult time. My brother spent 5 weeks in ICU. And I know that if it was, 25 years ago, say, I would have, that, my old eating habits and patterns would have drawn me back into that. But there was absolutely not even a flicker of a thought that I would behave that way anymore. And it's been like that for a long, long time.
Do you think for you too, it's because I think one thing I've learned about for me is that has less to do with knowing the skills of, how to tolerate an urge or those types of things, and more my comfort and my willingness to be in discomfort and pain. And, like when you're going through what you're going through with your brother, that's painful, that's anxiety provoking, you feel out of control, there's fear, like all these things. Do you think it's your comfort with being in those places now that also makes it so you don't feel that pull to go to those things, or does it feel different for you?
I think there was no pull whatsoever. And I do think, you know, like you mentioned briefly just a few moments ago, you know, my brain has completely rewired, and there is
Yeah.
no whatsoever any thought of binging and purging
Yeah.
or restricting in traumatic situations. But I think it's a really good example that I know in the past where I would have gone with that.
Yeah.
And I was, when my mother died, when I was in my 30s, I had been in recovery for a number of years, but that definitely was a huge pullback to my old patterns then, even though, yeah, it had been a number of years in my recovery.
Yeah.
But for so many years now, you know, there is no thought whatsoever of ever
Yeah.
doing anything like that.
Yeah. And what a sort of a beautiful gift to then share that with people, to see, again, this is a lifelong commitment, to just know that it's a part of your story. But now the commitment for you is just being aware of it and getting to almost celebrate the work that you've put into where you've come. Because like you said, it's got to feel almost like a complete self change. Like that was a completely different person, even though it's not. But to know, like, I don't even have that thought, whereas the person before was so deeply embedded in and like in a relationship with those thoughts, that like the thought of not being together was, you know, not even on the table for so long.
Absolutely. The thought of not being together is just the most traumatic thought ever.
Yeah.
Not being able to cope with
Right.
life, anything in life.
Yeah.
And so it's such an extreme, from one extreme to the other. It's a miracle.
Hmm.
But you know, and I think over the years, having learnt so many different techniques and tips and ways to cope with it, has all kind of built on top and built up and built up, and given me the knowledge to be able to break free.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. So with regards to your clients and the layers of the onion,
Hmm.
so Kyira, could you tell us briefly sort of how you would take them just briefly through each layer as it's unpeeled?
Yeah. I mean, I always think that typically when I see a client for the first time, they're either in a position I need to refer up. So I now really only work with people in the outpatient setting. So if, saying, okay, we need a higher level of care from a medical standpoint, or a lot of the times they might be transitioning down from those higher levels of care. It's very uncommon that I often will get a patient walking in the door that what their needs are directly matches what I'm giving. So usually there's some sort of transitioning process from one level of care or another. So pretty much I would say they're not starting often their journey with me. So that changes it a little bit, because I think in the beginning, so much where somebody starts is just psychoeducation around what's going on, and really helping, at least my focus is on externalization of the sort of problem. You know, in DBT, they talk about like the eating disorder brain, and they talk about that in so many other platforms too, but really this idea of seeing almost like a second entity of the self that has shown up, and really giving a lot of education around that and why that might be happening. I use a lot of internal family systems modeling to explain how it works as a form of protection. It's just kind of like got no functioning other than all or nothing, yes or no, like a really early version of the computer. So it's just kind of destructive, because it's like, well, everything is bad or everything is intolerable. Use this skill at all times. And so I think it starts off a lot of that, and a lot of working through resistance, because I think as you do that, it's being able to sit with somebody when they're going to try to push you away at all costs. Because we know for many of us, our eating disorders are coping skills for intense pain and trauma, but particularly kind of interpersonal blocks and pain. And so
Yes.
really allowing the initial part of our relationship to be about establishing trust, moving through those resistance points, and establishing boundaries within the context of that relationship that holds them accountable, but still creates a lot of compassion. And so I think, you know, there's eating disorder specific things we're doing. We're working on controlling binges and purges, and how do we recognize those skills or recognize those specific behaviors and when we're called to them, and how we navigate that into stress tolerance. But I think on the back end, the first thing I'm really focused on is like, that's great, I want to interrupt the behaviors, but I really need to lay the foundation for trust first, and then kind of working on those pieces. And then I think as people kind of get a hold on that and really start to put those things into practice, I think that the kind of first, I don't know, some arbitrary number, but I guess like 70 to 90% of the work feels like it's in those initial acute stages. How do we stop a lot of those behaviors or minimize them? How do we kind of become aware of the thoughts, redirect the thoughts, move through them, build emotional intelligence? But again, I think there's this transition point then of what's the long term. And I think a lot of that has to do with going a bit deeper and talking about the role of shame and fear. And so a lot of the conversations I do when we're sort of out of the trenches of the immediate sort of high acuity pieces is to talk through how we got here, how it serves us, why that's going to come up again, and how do we wire different responses. And I think that really gives space for people to grieve things like living in a world, I practice in the US, and we have a lot of systems of oppression that make it as such that people seem like they're walking in the door coming from behind with race, gender, sexual orientation, all these pieces. So talking about that, talking about shame there, talking about shame in their family dynamics. And I think a lot of that work is really then about developing systems for radical acceptance and self and other forgiveness, and thinking about what that looks like to kind of integrate past, present, and future self, so we aren't getting stuck in the pain or getting stuck in a situation. And then it's really, I think, I tend to see people for about 2 to 3 years of time in their recovery if they're kind of committed to this process in a long-term pathway. Sometimes people end earlier, but really watching them getting to that point where maybe they're more in maintenance now. And so a lot of it is like, oh, this new thing happened and I'm recognizing these patterns. And now what do I do with this? Because I know I don't want this. And I always talk about this as kind of the stage where we switch from avoidant goal setting to approach goal setting. Because early on in recovery, it's like, how do we avoid doing these things and stop doing this? And we know we don't want this anymore. But once they get clear on kind of what they do want, they've moved through their shame, they thought about their values, the life they want, and how their eating disorder doesn't fit in it. I feel like the rest of my time is about creating approach goals and then giving them the skills and tools necessary to get there, and then giving them the space to be human along the way when it doesn't look like that sort of nice straight line trajectory.
Yeah, absolutely. And those huge changes, those even not huge, but minute changes, but huge to the individual.
Yeah.
And how powerful that is for them to recognize that and see, my gosh, I have made a miniature change, but it doesn't feel miniature to me, but it's building on that, isn't it?
Right. It's that one time that they're able to say what they wanted or needed in a given moment, and they stand by it, or they say no without an explanation to somebody and they realize it's okay. And on the outside, it's like all you did was say no to working late today, or, whatever it is. But that is such a minimization of how big that is, because it's not just about the saying no. It's what that represents in terms of, I think, their sense of self. And what we know, is that eating disorders erode the sense of self to get you to establish basically a codependent, abusive relationship with the eating disorder. And so when they do that, it's this, oh, wait a minute. I see myself as having worth and value and deserving to take up space in the room without feeling like I have to then punish myself or make myself smaller because of how it affects everyone else.
Yeah. And I think as well by in certain situations, a lot of people find it difficult and feel that they have to explain themselves.
Yeah.
And what's really important to understand is that there is no need to do that in most situations. You don't have to explain yourself.
Right.
And recognizing that you don't have to do that.
Well, and I think that's the severing of, I still struggle with this now, and obviously I haven't worked with the majority of people on the planet that struggle with eating disorders. And I would say that the majority of people I have worked with either meet criteria for an anxiety disorder or have very strong anxiety presentations. So it's not just in relation to again, this like specific around food or their body or how they're using those skills to cope. Their brain is sort of in this state of hypervigilance and panic. And I think it connects so much to shame of just this, well, what are they going to think about me? Are people going to be mad at me? I still struggle with that. And it's needing to realize, even if they are, is living my life to try to stop everybody else from thinking and feeling a certain way actually getting me to where I want to go? Or am I just anxious in a different format? And what would it look like to start to learn to be okay with, I can't control everything, or I don't actually need everybody to like me, or I can make a choice that's best for me and people don't have to understand it and I don't have to explain it to them because I don't owe them that. That doesn't mean I'm being mean or hurtful to anybody else. It means that I'm saying I deserve to be able to make a choice without getting the buy-in from everyone around me. So I think that kind of disconnection from external validation, but also controlling the external environment, really allows you to kind of do that deeper work on the eating disorder recovery side as well.
Yeah, and kind of unraveling that and identifying what the for what reason you have agreed, or would you continually agree to working late, say,
Right.
even though it's, you know, it's not something that you really want to do. And you know, quite often I think for something like that, it boils down to a limiting negative belief maybe that they have about themselves, that, you know, if they were to say no, then, you know, people won't like them, and a number of other different negative thoughts that they have.
Right. Exactly. And again, and I know we kind of alluded to this in the beginning, but this idea of how quickly you can get there, because I think as we talk about this and people hear conversations, they go, okay, well, yeah, I could see that. Like, one person being mad at me doesn't mean the whole world is going to hate me and I'll have no friends or
Yeah,
connections.
right. Generalization. Yeah.
Right. But it is not how your brain works. I mean, I've had these situations happen, and now, you know, maybe I don't turn to the binge and purge. I don't turn to weeks of restriction to sort of make up for these quote unquote deficiencies that my brain would try to sell me on. But I do still go down those rabbit holes. You know, if I get one bad review of something, then suddenly it's like, well, I shouldn't even be in business, you know, or if I feel stuck with one patient, it's like, I'm the worst therapist on the planet. But this sort of gross overgeneralization that are those limiting beliefs kind of bring you to, but it's so quick. It is such a fast jump there. And that's part of, I think, the long-term eating disorder recovery. And now for me, kind of the second leg of anxiety recovery is to try to slow that process, slow that, like when that trigger point comes in, when that thought or that invitation is what I see them as, is like the invitation to come to this party that I know sucks. Like, it doesn't feel good. I don't like myself in it. I don't want to be there.
Yeah.
How do I learn how to say no versus just getting swept up and going to the party right away? And I think that is the part that, again, then the next layer of self-compassion comes into play, to realize logically now you might get it, and then there's going to be moments that you don't, and that doesn't make you a bad person. It means we have to figure out why we're sliding so quickly to cause those interruptions so that we don't.
Yeah, and awareness is the first step.
Right.
But you are beginning to slide, and it's that old pattern, you know. And like you said, it's slowing it all down.
Yeah.
And starting to really tune in to what specific thoughts that you're having that are then driving you into that negative behavior.
Well, I even had to learn, and I think this was part of why I couldn't get a handle on some of my anxiety and sort of my complex trauma sort of reactions while I was in the depths of my eating disorders. I think a lot of that requires you to work on body intelligence and emotional intelligence. And when your eating disorder is basically, at least for me, really acting in a way that it was deadening those things. I didn't have a connection with my body. You know, we can say simple things like, I don't know my hunger and fullness cues, but like, I just didn't have a connection to my body anymore.
Yeah.
So then learning what that awareness looks like in a body I have spent years avoiding a relationship with, I think that feels very daunting for people.
Yeah.
And it happens. Like, it's slowly, your body comes back online. The wiring, like, it's there. You have to trust that process. And I think that, again, is what comes from those early conversations around, you know, these things do come, and it's not even necessarily a direct thing you need to do. It's sort of an indirect benefit of doing some of this other work. You will have your body come back online, and then we can learn on how you address it. And now I can recognize when I start to feel those cues in my body. I even can see one of the thoughts that starts to happen in my preoccupation is I will start to feel body image distress. And it's that immediate thing again. But when I go, why am I feeling that so much lately? Like, what's going on? You know, and obviously there might be things like your hormones and stuff, but also going, oh, I'm anxious. And
Absolutely.
this is
It's asking yourself what specifically, so why, why am I feeling like this?
exactly.
It's the first answer that comes in. Because
Yes,
there's part of you that will know what the answer is before
exactly.
your conscious mind starts to mull it over and go, oh no, that's not right.
Right.
But
And
it's
if you
first.
pause, yes, exactly.
Yeah. And so tell me, tell me about your anxiety when you had your eating disorder.
I mean, I would say that my anxiety has predated and postdated my eating disorder. It's tricky for me now having, I didn't really actually get diagnosed with PTSD until I was 31 or 32, although I think it was there. Like I had really high ACE scores and all these pieces, or adverse childhood experiences. But it was I was always sort of an anxious child, but I think kind of went unnoticed because I was the high performing sort of perfectionist manifestation of it. And so to the outside world, it looked like, well, she gets, the straight A's. She's constantly like working to be better. And this is diligence and perseverance and hard work. But on the back end, it was always this sort of panic of what would happen if I wasn't acting in that way. And then also having gone through some pretty traumatic abandonment pieces with my mom, a lot of my anxiety was around people leaving. So when you see that sort of paired with limiting beliefs of not being deserving of connection, matched with the people that are supposed to be there not being there, I think all of it really kind of ripened the stage for shame to come in to say, well, you have to then act under these rules and do these things to be worthy, to be good enough, to be taken seriously. And that, showed up in my body, obviously, but also in like how I performed in all these different ways. And so I think learning to shed that I remember even in grad school and one of my supervisors being like, what would it be like if you just didn't turn in your last assignment for my class and just got a B? What if we just did that? And I was like, that cannot happen. I cannot do that. And I think now I might be able to entertain the idea, but I couldn't access it because to me, it felt like too much was at stake. Like it always felt like if I didn't do this thing right, everything else would fall after that catastrophic thinking. And I think, the next layer of my anxiety as I've gotten a handle on that and realized I don't have to be perfect to be loved or to be worthy has now been realizing that I don't always have to be sort of in a state of hypervigilance and over planning. I'm really working on differentiating between preparedness and resilience versus over planning. And so what does that look like to build self-efficacy, to trust when things happen, I'll be okay, instead of trying to plan for what will happen and what will I do. So I think that's kind of my current onion layer that I'm working on. And then I'm sure there's another piece of it once I get through that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. You've done so much work on yourself.
But I think it's that piece. I mean, you see that too. Like you said, you've gotten to this point with your eating disorder where it's no longer even a thought. And I think those are the pieces where I've realized, and especially when you get the gift of being able to be the person helping somebody else, like as their therapist or, whatever role that is, it's that realizing all of us are trying to figure out what it means to be human. And we're exploring it in so many different ways. And there are I did equine therapy once in like a training as a developing professional. And so all of us therapists were there trying to help this horse. I don't know if you've ever done this before.
I haven't known.
Get the horse from one side to the other to get to what I forget was on the end, but there's like bushels of apples and sugar cubes and like all this stuff along the way. And it's and you can't walk with them. You're on the outside of these barriers and you and another person have a rope and your one rope is shorter than the other. And it's learning, how do you support someone? How do you collaborate with, teams? It's just this beautiful activity. But it was just sort of this realization of like, that is literally life right there. We are constantly evolving and changing. The path is changing all the time. There's the constant need to balance short-term versus long-term distress. Everybody's just looking to feel a part of something. And so I think like I used to be overwhelmed by the work. And now what I get excited about is the realization of what comes and how I become a better person and a better therapist, how I enjoy my life more, how I can now look back at that other part of me with kindness instead of judgment and self-loathing. And I think the more you do that, kind of like you said, the more the kind of behaviors get extinguished, the easier it is, the more you keep doing it. I think the more I do this work, the more excited I get about the next part of this work, because it just feels like it's what creates fulfillment in life versus sort of the coping, avoiding all these other pieces where I didn't get to feel life in the ways that I do now.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Didn't get to feel life. And I think, that, like you said, that we are, even at my great age, we are all evolving continually and learning. And then that just continues throughout your life. I
Absolutely.
presume. Yeah. And so there's always plenty of positive changes to be made.
Mm-hmm. And I think
different things that are thrown at us.
Exactly. And allowing that to be something we get excited about rather than allowing it to be this thing, because I think we all are sort of taught, get to a point of feeling, good, get to this end point, and then you're recovered, you're healed, you're whatever, and like then everything's going to be good. And I think instead it's like, oh gosh, there's so much more work to be done. But it's more just the invitation to keep exploring your life. And so I think when I see it as that, is like, there is no end point, because the goal is to just keep going and going and going.
Evolving,
then it doesn't, weirdly, it feels less exhausting. It feels more exciting because you go, oh, I'm not in a race with anybody else. I'm just digging through my own tunnel to explore life in the ways that I choose to. And I get to make that choice and do it the ways that I want.
Oh, that's beautiful, Kyira. Beautiful. Wow. Well, how can people, as you work with people with eating disorders, so if they wanted to contact you, how would they do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the best way to connect with me is just to head over to my website. So heading over to adversityrising.com, there's a contact page. They can email me there. My work in a private practice right now is through a different organization, and I know we're pretty full up. So a lot of the conversations I've had with people is just, what are some other resources, tools, skills, or just having a conversation around kind of how can we work together and what could that look like to best support people. But I know even after our last session, having lots of conversations with people that emailed me just about, I don't know what the next step is, and I just want to talk to somebody about how do you even start that process. And so even if it's like, hey, I'm not necessarily looking to work together, I've just got questions, I think that's a great thing too. Yeah. So heading there, and I've got tons of great resources, but also just the ability to connect with people directly straight from my website.
Oh, fabulous. Fabulous, Kyira. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. And I can't wait until your book is finally released and ready to go, so I can dive in as well and use that in my next layer of the onion work.
Oh, thank you, Kyira. So thank you so much. Well, that's all for today's episode of Bulimia Sucks. And thank you to everybody for listening. And make sure you subscribe to the podcast on Apple iTunes so you never miss an episode. And also let us know what you think of your favorite podcast by leaving us a review on wherever you listen, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, iTunes, wherever it may be. So thank you to everybody for listening, and Kyira. And I look forward to speaking to you in the next episode.